Hello, BookTube. I'm here with a tag, an original tag, I believe. I'm calling it the Lost to Books tag. If it's not original, if it has been done before, hopefully mine has a bit of a twist on it. There's no huge number of prompts. It's basically describing a moment, pre and then post moment in your life where you realized you were lost to books, whether it be just reading or reading and collecting or collecting. But I would think if you're collecting, the reading comes in as well. So the idea is um, that's the central point of it. So describe what led you up to that point. Describe that point, and then the point that after that. And the aftermath is sort of how that has affected your life. The books have affected your life, if there is any effect on your life. So let's get started with myself. Goes back to before I was 10 years old, so we're talking the early 70s in northern Ontario, Canada. I grew up on an island and rural area, and so a large number of years, up to probably about 1980, we lived without electricity, indoor plumbing, running water, anything like that. And at the winter time, the roads would be snowed in, and there'd be no plow. They wouldn't plow the roads for several miles because it was so deep and it was so isolated. And weren't well, we weren't worth well, I suppose, and a few others that were living there. So isolated, long times. Being a child without company. I did have my family. I had brothers, but you know how that is. Sometimes you're the third or the fourth wheel or whatever. Um, so I had to you know um, interest myself and occupy myself with things. And reading became one of those. Listening to the radio music, but old time radio became another one. Um, but this is to more concentrate on books here. So I remember reading a little bit as a child, not a lot. I never really. I read sort of to not be bored, I suppose. It was something to fill up the time. And didn't have a huge lot of books in the house. My dad was did read, and he was a fan of Zane Grey. So we had some Zane Grey books, so I'd read those westerns. Um, and I remember a time going to a junk shop and buying. Uh, well, there's two books that I remember by title. I don't remember. There was a couple Zane Grey ones that may or may not have my dad had or not. But the one there was a hardcover. It was early 1900s. It had a pictorial paste down on it, from what I remember. It was in rough shape, I think, but it was called The Squaw Man. Don't remember who it was by. All I know is that there was a silent film that was made either from that novel or from the play, and I don't know the connection. I've never really looked into it. It's just that I remember seeing because I'm interested in silent film, seeing silent film and wondering if it was the same. So there's a lot going on here at the moment. Sirens. There's been a few today. But anyway, so getting back to westerns, yeah. So the Squaw Man. The other one was a little paperback, and it must have been an Avon paperback because it was yellow. Um, sure it was. But anyway, I remember the title. Don't remember the author. It's Five Graves to Boot Hill. I remember the cover. There's somebody on a horse rearing up on its hind legs, and he's shooting, I think, into the window of a building or something like that, or somebody shooting at him from the window of a building. And it's your typical story. I don't remember much about it, but I remember something about lawmen getting the bad guys. Big surprise for a western, I suppose. But yeah, and those were sort of the mainstay. But also too, that got me interested in some other subjects was my dad was a country music fan, so listened to the radio. We had a record player that would run on batteries. We also had a wind up one at some point, I'm sure. But he liked Johnny Horton, and he was a '50s singer, rockabilly, and he sung about sort of historical things, usually Americana mostly. 19th century and before. So he would sing about Andrew Jackson. He would sing about War of 1814 against the British. Uh, Trappers, the Wild West, uh, and a few things about Indians. And I always wondered, were any of these things true? So the meager books that I got from my school library when school was in, it piqued my interest in history, and that's the start of it. And then I think uh, somehow either through that sort of osmosis or other thing, picking up National Geographic magazines, seeing stuff about ancient Egypt and ancient history and Africa, sort of interested in Africa. But remember getting books in the library about the pyramids and Greek and Roman history, kids books. But also, I remember because of Africa, I remember I was interested in exploration. It must have been from an article from National Geographic that talked about exploration that I got a book out of the library on African exploration. I remember, and then more specifically later, a sort of juvenile children's biography of David Livingstone, who I began to be interested in. There was another sort of singer, uh, Tony Robbins. Tony Robbins. Oh, my memories. I just had his name a few moments ago. But anyway, he wrote sort of stuff about Pancho and Villa, sort of the West, but more Mexican sort of oriented, Western type music. And that got me interested as well. Marty Robbins. Marty Robbins, that's it. Not Tony Robbins. Tony Robbins is writer, I think. Marty Robbins. Um, but yeah, that's sort of, piqued my interest in things, and didn't have really any money much to buy anything, especially up until the mid to late 70s. There were jobs in the summer with other farmers, my brothers who were older, did haying. I did a little bit, got a little bit of money to sort of buy things and buy some books. I remember, but the big thing that I got my money from was getting the deposit on beer bottles and pop bottles, which there was lots of drinking and driving. There must have been at that time because a lot of the beer bottles and pop bottles as well were collected along the roads, the side roads. So when we went anywhere, if we had time, my dad would drop us off. He'd pull up a ways, and then we'd walk up each side of the road collecting the beer bottles and pop bottles for a deposit. At that time, I remember the beginning of that was like there was 1 cent, 1 penny per beer bottle, and it varied for pop bottles, small ones, maybe 5 cents, 10 cents, and then 20 some cents. The beer bottles eventually doubled, went up to 2 cents, and then later went up to 10 cents. So that made a big boon in the number of the amount of money you could get. But it was enough to get things, and also going into dumps, getting things because there was one especially there was two dumps on one side of the road. The side road was the normal household stuff, but the other side was sort of mechanical things like cars and things like that. So my dad, like it wasn't so much a dump; it was like a scrap yard, but it was a dump scrap yard. So my dad would go in and occasionally into that one to get car parts or other pieces of metal because he would weld. So he would get that stuff there because they're perfectly well. Like people would just literally drive cars in, and just because they had nowhere else to put them, they would just sort of dump them there. And they were still, some of them were drivable. But yeah, so he'd harvest parts that he needed, and then while I would go into the other side, go through the garbage and get beer bottles and pop bottles for a deposit, and that was a great boon because people weren't generally interested in returning them for the deposit. They just threw them out in the garbage. But anyway, so that's where I had some money, and I remember buying again some other westerns from spinner racks in the small towns that we go to. I remember going into a place and they had these big round chunks of cheese that we'd buy. My dad would buy like nice old cheddar, so we'd slice off like a little wedge of it, but from this, and get our beef from there. There was a butcher, all sorts of things, and like old wood floors. There was, it just sort of, I probably if I saw it now, I'd think what a dump this place was. But the memories are that these were fantastic places. Aladdin's, cave for stuff. And I remember some spinner racks, and I remember buying. Hey, there's some other westerns in paperback and some shiny looking science fiction books, and I also remember buying some comics. I wasn't into the sort of superhero stuff so much. I think I probably bought some Wonder Woman and Superman comics, but the comics that I bought were more like I remember there was Creepy Tales or something like that, and Scooby Doo and a few things like that. Those were in Donald Duck. I remember buying. That's where I sort of spent my money on locally. And then later in the 70s, I remember going to a bigger town, about 100 and some miles, 150 miles away, and there was an actual bookstore, Cole's Bookstore. I don't remember buying too much of it, but there was one thing that I specifically remember buying. I think it was the first thing I bought there. And it's weird how certain things stand out in my mind, and don't know why this one does. I bought the first, I found out later, it was the first photo novel of the Star Trek series of photo novels. I don't know how many they made, but this was City on the Edge of Forever. It was an episode I really, really liked. And it turned out later there was a good reason for it because it was well written by Harlan Ellison and blah, blah, blah. But at the time, I didn't know any of that stuff. I just knew I liked it, and I bought that. It's not much of a reading thing because there's photos, and then there's little bubbles, like cartoon bubbles with some words on it, and maybe some other text linking things together. But I also remember around that time getting, and I don't know where it came from, was the Star Trek Starfleet manual. It was a plastic cover. It had a plastic insert in the front where the cover sort of was, and it was just a blue cover saying Starfleet Technical Manual or something like that. And you open it up, it's still plastic, and there was a paperback. I think the back cover was slid into another sleeve in there, sort of held it, and it was sort of schematics for the Enterprise, possibly other ships. I don't remember, but I remember the Enterprise. And then at school as well, because I had a little bit of money occasionally, they'd have this thing, and I'm not sure it was Scholastic books. It could have been Scholastic books that came. We get this little list of things every month or two. We could buy books, and all I remember buying, and I'm sure I bought other ones, but all I remember buying for year after year was Farley Mowat books, which I liked at the time. But I never was a committed reader. I never really, thought I was, a great reader in any way. It was more or less to pass the time, to keep me from being bored, and I think it got me out of trouble at school somehow or something like that because, being reading or getting out of doing things by going into the library. Volunteering in the library. So it got me out of things, so I used it as an excuse probably. But yeah, and it wasn't until like in late 1980, when I was 14, I moved to Toronto. And shortly after that, in 81, I started working as well. So I had cash in hand. I was going to school at that time until I was 15, and I left school and then worked full time. But that's another story. I did a lot of things around then. Maybe not great things. Anyway, I won't get into those details because they're not really book related. But I had cash in hand, and I'm in a big city. And I was in a city that had a street called Queen Street East, Queen Street West, that had, it must have been 15 to 18 bookshops, new bookshops, and a good dozen used bookshops. Anywhere from just nickel and dime paperbacks to antiquarian bookshops. And I remember a few of the antiquarian bookshops that I wasn't allowed to touch the books in the thing because they didn't think I was young, and they didn't think I would, or they didn't think I could afford it, and it would damage it. And but I eventually did buy a few things there because I had to show my cash first to say that I had $100 I was going to buy a book or two, so um, you know so I was able to. But getting back to sort of the pedestrian type books, the run of the mill, uh, some of the first ones I remember buying, it must have been '81, was classics, the Penguin Classics. I remember getting it. I'm sure it was at a little annex of the Village Bookshop down a side alley, and I'm almost 100% sure the first three were uh, Livy's War with Hannibal, Herodotus's Histories, and Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. So I started reading those. I liked them, and I continued buying these. And I bought other things. And as I said, I'd already read sort of biography of Livingston, and I was interested in that. And I read articles about African history and African culture through National Geographic, and I really enjoyed those. So I started buying National Geographics as well, and especially getting the maps. And I remember maps of Africa and African countries, and poring over these, and sort of trying to remember sort of areas and things like that. And I remember it was, I think it was at one of the local public libraries that had a little bit of a table sale. Most of them were probably ex-library, but again, like you always get some that aren't. And I still have. It's the only book that I have of stuff that well, I still got some stuff back in Canada, but the only one that I have with me, I think, book-wise, I think it's the only one. No, I have one other thing, a magazine. But anyway, that's a different story. But I picked up this book, Livingston, Tim Jeals. It's 1973. This turns out to be like a third printing. You can see where they had the little sticker on, and I took that off, and it took part of the cover. And that, dear folks, is an ink stain, not blood stain, red ink. And I thoroughly enjoyed this. I loved it, and I wanted to learn more, so I started reading more of Livingston. I bought other ones. I took out of the library. Eventually, I brought this here, as I say, and I just as an aside, in 2012, he was at the Oxford Literary Festival, and I got him to sign this on 25th of March 2012, and I still got the ticket that I used to get in. Is that upside down? So yeah. But anyway, yeah, I had other ones, and I remember going back to Queen Street. These are replacement copies because I've since sold them. But there's 2 volumes, David Livingstone's Family Letters. These were expensive at the time. They were $25, $26. That was a lot for me in like 1981. But I bought them, I wanted them, and then eventually got another slim volume of selected letters, I think it was. I think from Abelard Books as well. That probably was $8, $10, $12 or something like that. But also I found out somehow that the last journals of David Livingstone had been published and were still in print as a reprint. I think it was Greenwood Press, because I had to research, find it out in the library. And then I went to the only bookshop that I knew where I could get it was in Toronto as well, on Yonge Street, north of Bloor, called Albert Britnell's. Albert Britnell was the oldest, I think, surviving bookshop at the time in Toronto. It's since closed. I think it probably closed about 20 years ago, maybe or shortly before I even came to England, sadly. But it was a fabulous bookshop. It was small. It was all new as far as I can remember. I don't think there was any used books in there. But I remember them having sets of Dickens, new Oxford Dickens, all sorts of stuff. They're just fabulous books, and they had this big counter at the back where they would have the huge wall of. Later, I found out what they were. Books in print, the Whitaker's books in print for English books. And other ones as well for other kinds. They had Canadian books in print, the American books. They had stuff for other countries as well, books in print. So they had all the research there. So I asked them, and I did actually some of the research for myself, and I was quite proud of this. I laid it down, and I had the ISBN number and everything. So yeah, that'll be easy to get. And I don't remember the exact price, but again, it was very expensive for me. it could have been 50 or 55. I think US dollars was the price. So whatever it cost at the time. So it would have been 60 some dollars or more at the time. So it was very expensive for me to outlay for these two volumes. But it was something that I really enjoyed getting. And this is 1981, 1982. There's a few other things that sort of prompted me that I realized that that's the time that I was lost everything because I found my pilgrimage down to sort of Queen Street went via Young Street and Dundas, where there was record shops. There was the new record shop, Sam the Record Man, multi-story new records all throughout. And then beside that, or just a little north of that on the same side, was the Vinyl Museum, and there were some other used ones. But in Sam the Record Man, at some point, and around 1982, I think it must have been 82, because I'm sure that's when it came out. I got an album. It jumped out at me. It was called Jaluka. Was the the Scatterlings of Africa was the name of the album, but Jaluka was the group. And I picked it up because I loved the cover of it. It was like an African painting type thing, and so I loved it. And I looked in it and I found out that it was a South African band, white South African with a Zulu. They sort of started the band, and I found out later that Jaluka meant sweat in Zulu. And I just thoroughly loved the album, and I wanted to get more, and I started getting into the music and everything like that. So that really got me more interested into Africa. And then around the same time at the Village Bookshop, this is a new replacement copy that I got today. I bought this, The Boer War, by Thomas Pakenham, and I love that. But other histories too, like all this sort of stuff came flooding in because it was the first time I was in a city and I had money in my hands, and it was disposable money that I could spend, and I bought books. I remember getting the set of Will and Ariel Durant's history, reading all the way through, reading the first volume several times. Also, I remember at some point getting I think a Chester Star. It could have been later '80s, but I kind of think it might be there on ancient history, Greek and Roman, I think it was, or maybe just Roman history, that I thoroughly love. I read several times throughout the '80s. I also discovered God's Graves of Scholars, which is a big thing, and that really prompted me into archaeology. And other things that happened, like 1982, I think it was around that time, I remember seeing, I think it must have been about that time that I saw Basil Davidson's Africa series, that again entrenched my interest in Africa. And then, ancient history more so with Michael Wood's the Search for the Trojan War, and reading the book as well at the time, and it's most definitely, and then also too, I think in 1982, like all this sort of culminated in 80, sort of 81, 82, 83, I found James Michener's The Covenant, which dealt with South Africa, and thoroughly loved that, read that. And it's just, so basically 1981, 82, 3 was the time that I was lost to books. After that, I was definitely, it sort of ruled my life. I started buying books like hand over fist in some ways. So in 1989, I moved to Kitchener-Waterloo to go to university for archaeology, starting out Near Eastern and finishing up in the early 90s with North American archaeology. But the books sort of dictated, because I had to find a place that I didn't have a huge number of books at that point, but I had enough that I couldn't just sit in a small room or a small apartment. I needed a big enough apartment and have shelves for all my books, so that dictated it. And then, I went through, university, buying more books. After I did a field school in 1991 in Jordan. When I came back, I had no money, and I realized that because I went to field schools a couple of years in a row, I used up a lot of my OSAP, which was Ontario Student Assistance Program, the grants and the loans. So when I came back for 91 and 92 year, I didn't have enough money to, there was enough money to pay for the courses, the tuition, but I didn't have not any money for food, let alone rent or anything like that. So I had this history of buying and selling books. So I started buying and selling books to bookshops and like locally. I didn't want to really sell too much of my own. So I would. There was one bookshop in Kitchener that would have a bin that was 10-cent books, a dime bin, and I would spend $1 or $2 there every day or two because the stuff would just churn over very quickly, and it was good quality stuff, paperback. So, and then I would walk them around to another bookshop and sell most of them for like $1 each. So I'd get anywhere from like maybe $12 to $20 if I sold them all. Buying $2 worth, so I made $18. That's enough for food for a little while. I remember eating a lot of potatoes at that time. But yeah, and then it sort of continued that way. I got through that, that winter by doing this, walking to Waterloo for the school. And then I started working. I worked for a salvage company doing archaeology. That sort of dried up a little bit, and it was starting to dry up in late sort of 93. 94 was a tough year, and then I still decided to start my own book business. So that's dictated it, books, but I had books that I used myself, but I also had a seed money of $100 that I bought some books that I resold to a bookshop. And I got $1,000 for. So that was my real seed money for the bookshop, sort of bookshop, but online. So but I realized that I wasn't getting enough books in, so I had to use my own in order to get enough money for rent and to survive. So they helped me do that, and then I had the bookshop from about 95 to 2005. Went to just before I came to England here in 2005. So I had to divest myself of everything to get here. And then I only brought a few books with me. This was one of them, and I had a couple other books on Batsfords, on cathedrals and churches. And I started working, but then the job was only temporary, and I was out of work for quite a while. I was actually homeless for a little while. I got another job. I was sort of just eking out on whatever money I had, but then I realized that I had another week or so to go before I got my first paycheck. I had no money for food, no money for buses, so I had to walk. I was homeless there for a while, but I didn't have any money for food, so I sold the Batsford books and I kept all hold of the Livingston. So that got me through for some money, so it was a good steed for that. Yeah, and then I started working again. I started getting getting more books, buying DVDs and stuff like this. And then things went sort of not so good again for a while. That it took me a few years to find work. And because of my situation here, I couldn't get any help for the government because I wasn't I was just here on a visa, so I had the right to starve to death in a sense. Because if I did anything else and I got any help, I would be infringement of my visa and I would have to leave. Which, without money, that's kind of difficult to do. So anyway, I lived for a couple year and a half until I got my current job, or a couple years really, off of reselling some of my books, but mostly my DVDs. So a little aside with DVDs, not so much books, but yeah. So that's my sort of lead up to the moment of 81, 82, 83 that I knew I was lost to books. And how books affected my life, because they affect, like, every time I go to move, I've got to think of things. I'm tied down. I can't just simply get up and move anywhere because I've got all these books. So that affects one's life and one's outlook on life as well. So I'd love to hear your experience in this, and as rambling as you want to be. The event, identify the event where you were lost to books, either reading or collecting or both. And then tell me how you led up to that and how it's affected you since. And we're just up to 30 minutes, so that's good. It's a long tag, but I do appreciate everybody sticking with me here. And I'm not tagging anybody, but I do want to hear anybody who has that, an experience like that. Take care, BookTube.